Saul Alinsky opens his book, Rules for Radicals, with the following. As an organizer, I start from where the world is, not as I would like it to be, but the way it is, as it is. That we accept the world as it is does not in any sense weaken our desire to change it into what we believe it should be. It is necessary to begin where the world is if we're going to change it to what we think it should be. My recent trip to the border was largely about seeing the situation there as it really is. It didn't take long being in Ajo, Arizona. How many of you have been in Ajo, Arizona? A number of you. It didn't take long being there before the 60 or so clergy and lay faith leaders confronted the gravity of what we were about to do. On our first morning in Ajo, one of the No More Deaths volunteers announced that a man had been found dead the night before, having likely died from exposure in the desert. He'd been living in the U.S. for 20 years, had a wife and 2 kids with another on the way when he was deported recently. Desperate to be reunited with his family, he attempted the dangerous 50-mile desert crossing. We were encouraged to donate to his family, who were unable to afford a funeral. Sadly, this was nothing new for the folks from No More Deaths. Since 2004, they've been offering humanitarian aid to migrants. They conduct search and rescue runs when law enforcement and Border Patrol don't respond to calls for help from folks stranded in the desert. And they place water in the dangerous desert crossing through which the U.S. government is intentionally funneling migrants into our country. It has not always been this way. In some ways, the context for the situation we're in now goes back to the founding of our nation, but I didn't think I could do all that in 20 or 25 minutes. So to keep it to a reasonable length, and with apologies if this is review, it might be good to start with the North American Free Trade Agreement. The thinking when NAFTA was passed in '94 was that it would slow undocumented migration as free trade improved the Mexican economy. But just the opposite happened in the years immediately following NAFTA's passage. The Mexican economy was flooded with cheap corn and other farm products subsidized by the American government, and Mexican farmers couldn't keep up. So Mexico's agricultural economy was, to some degree, destabilized. Mexican farmers couldn't afford to raise their crops, and the people whose livelihoods depended on being able to sell things to those farmers were run out of business too. As a result, undocumented migration into the United States from Mexico increased dramatically in the mid to late 90s. Much of this was predicted by immigration scholars, who also advised the U.S. that if it was interested in eventually slowing migration from the South, it should work to improve the economies there. Instead, fear, maybe the residual fear later from 2001, has led our country to be hateful. Prevention by deterrence became the accepted practice. Whether fleeing poverty or violence in their home countries, migrants who came into the U.S. without papers would now be treated as criminals. Now, all of them. We're trying to treat all of them as criminals. Prevention through deterrence was a Clinton-era policy in which entries through safer urban places were shut off and people were forced in numbers through the harsh terrain of the southern Arizona desert. There is no way to tell how many people have died in this corridor since the 90s when the policy was enacted. Border Patrol says at least 6,000. Estimates by aid groups like No More Deaths are that over 7,000 sets of human remains have been found, but as many as double that number have likely died in the desert. Bodies are destroyed by animals and decay quickly there. Every year it's estimated up to 200 people at least try to make this pilgrimage. In addition to being a dangerous natural environment, the desert around Ajo has become a hunting ground. Border Patrol, the presence of which has increased exponentially in the last few decades. ride the desert in trucks, SUVs, ATVs, dirt bikes, and helicopters, looking to arrest migrants. And volunteers like No More Deaths and the Aho Samaritans stride bravely into this space to leave water in the desert for people who are trying to cross. I should say that over 85% of the water that was left in the desert by No More Deaths volunteers was found to have been used in a recent study funded by the group. So back to prevention through deterrence. Though this is the official policy, every administration has to decide for itself how it will enforce it. Presidents Bush and Obama each listed priorities for deportation, implying that people who were not priorities might well be left alone, or at least not detained. The Trump administration's answer is to try to arrest every migrant possible and either detain or deport them. This is absolutely impossible, but they're trying, and that's the image they're putting out, certainly, in the news. And it seems the Border Patrol, to some degree, is annoyed by humanitarian aid groups. Recently, 9 No More Deaths volunteers were charged with federal crimes for leaving water in the desert, basically on a juiced-up littering charge. So they began planting cameras pointed at some of the locations where they left water along the migrant trails, and they showed us the videos of Border Patrol agents slashing and kicking the gallons of water left along the trails. Having criminalized migration, government agents are now trying to both make the passage as dangerous as possible and criminalize providing aid to migrants. Part of prevention through deterrence. If we make it life-threatening, they'll stop coming. Of course, it doesn't work. Some months ago, No More Deaths called for people of faith to make a water drop in the desert, risking charges, as their folks have been charged, in the name of fighting against the criminalization of giving and receiving humanitarian aid. If we receive charges, and although we haven't yet, we may still be charged, they have all our information, we will fight the charges in court and try to set the precedent that providing aid and receiving aid is legal. If we don't receive charges, we hope it will look odd to judges that authorities would charge No More Deaths volunteers, but not a bunch of clergy and other faith leaders who took the same action. We hope we've put them in a really difficult spot. So we gathered in Tucson last Friday afternoon for shared food and training. And Saturday we headed down to Ajo for more specific training. And I have to say, I was immediately blown away by the dedication, the wisdom, and the knowledge of the No More Deaths volunteers. They were mostly women in their 20s and 30s. And they told us stories of going out to find a migrant stranded in the desert when authorities refused to help. They told the story of a 29-year-old man who was chased by Border Patrol who hid and called his family on his cell phone to tell them he thought his foot was broken. And he was never heard from again. Chasing people, of course, increases the instances of these kinds of injuries and deaths. Sunday morning, we rose early for a pre-dawn breakfast in the Ajo Town Square. Then we headed out in 2 different groups, each with reporters from around the country in our caravan. One group would drive up to a well-known water drop location, hike over a mile in, drop water, and then hike back. My group of about 45 people went to a location 20 miles away from where they were going. We stood in a long line. Well, you could see us. Can you throw the picture back up, Mike? Is that possible? Oh, there it is. So we stood in a long line, stretched out. We were supposed to be about 10 feet apart. It doesn't look like we were at that point. And we walked about a half mile in, then planted our jugs of water under a scant the shelter of desert trees or shrubs in hopes that it would be found by migrants, and then we walked back. So the thinking on that strategy was that we know people come through that corridor and it's wide and vast, but we don't know exactly where they come through, so the No More Deaths volunteers thought that if we left the water in a line, if one person found it, they could spread the word that it was available. There was a rumor that the Fish and Wildlife folks who had jurisdiction out in the wilderness areas had 2 extra officers on duty in anticipation of our action. And in fact, I know that to be true because one of them stayed in the hotel room next to me. But during breakfast, a few times, vehicles drove by from Border Patrol or from Fish and Wildlife, keeping an eye on us, seeing if we were heading out yet. A Border Patrol vehicle even inadvertently got into the other caravan, got sandwiched between our cars as we were headed to the drop. We thought that was pretty funny. Both groups had our IDs checked by officers, and all of those exchanges were friendly. They took all of our information and wished us well. We were told by locals that the officers were on their best behavior for us as clergy, but that since they checked our permits to be on the land, they had all of our information and could still issue us citations. We thought they were leaving us alone, but the other group found out differently. One of their number got sick from the heat. And as the No More Deaths leaders were talking back and forth on walkie-talkies about how to get the sick person to safety, a Fish and Wildlife truck showed up, and the officer said, "Hey, we heard on the walkies that someone in your group is sick. We can drive them back up the hill." Sort of a combination of letting us know they were listening to our radio communication and making a show of being good people, which I don't doubt, frankly, that most of them are. In my group, after we'd walked across the desert in that long line for about 30 minutes, someone shouted, "Hold," which was a command that we had practiced in our training that meant everyone needed to stop immediately. Somebody had found a bone. It was probably an animal bone, the leaders told us, but there was no way to be absolutely sure. Human remains are regularly found there, so we got close to one another in that line and conducted a grid search. We were looking for more bones or items of clothing that would indicate that these were human remains. We didn't find anything else in our grid search, but the moment was a stark reminder of the cruelty being visited on our migrant neighbors. On our way back to the vans, one of my colleagues spotted some cloth stuck in a small shrub. And the No More Deaths folks told us it was a common find. Migrants wrapped their shoes in cloth or carpet to keep from leaving footprints in the desert. As I said, this dangerous stretch of desert has become a hunting ground. And as I would find out the next day, this wasn't the end of the migrant journey. On Monday, I spent a few hours, there were about 25 of us, observing Operation Streamline at the Federal District Court in Tucson. Operation Streamline is the mechanism that makes zero tolerance and prevention through deterrence possible by rushing 70-plus people a day through the courts. They're brought into the courtroom 7 at a time to stand in front of microphones, each having met in the morning with an attorney who is now standing behind them. As they stood in a line in front of the microphone, the judge asked each person detained in the desert just days before several questions through an interpreter. They pled guilty to unlawfully entering the United States and were either assigned detention or deportation. They pled guilty because they would have been punished more severely if they hadn't. Several seemed not to completely understand what they were being asked. The judge, for example, would say, "Do you plead guilty or not guilty?" And they would wait for the translation, and then they would say, "Sí." They clearly didn't completely understand what was happening. The judge asked them, "Did anyone promise you anything or threaten you to get you to plead guilty?" And a few of them stopped and seemed to be confused. And I wondered if it was because, yes, they had been promised something to plead guilty. They had been promised a lesser sentence, and that question, to me, was confusing. But the attorney would tap them on the shoulder and sometimes whisper to them, and they would give the answer. We don't have to treat people this way. It's true that unlawful entry has been on the books since 1929. But until 2005, unlawful entry was basically treated as an administrative violation, often at least. George W. Bush initiated Operation Streamline, Obama beefed it up, and now Trump is basically applying no discretion at all, attempting to prosecute every single person who crosses our southern border. And again, of course, that's impossible, but the cynical part of me says it is keeping private prisons full. It is rallying a large number of hard-right voters. I know that I am a privileged one. It was a privilege to be able to go there, to receive this call from No More Deaths, to be able to respond and go there to do the work. But it struck me that it was more of a privilege for me to be able to pack my things and come home. We saw the harsh corridor of desert through which the U.S. government forces people, intentionally endangering their lives in the name of deterrence. We honored the lives and grieved the deaths of those who didn't make it through the desert in a beautiful memorial service conducted by the volunteers. And we saw the machine in the courtroom that gathers up as many migrants as possible and either imprisons them or ships them back to their home countries, often either to poverty or mortal danger or both. A respected colleague said it well as we were leaving the courthouse. She said, when I kept hearing them say culpable, guilty in Spanish, she said, I wanted to say, you're not the one who's guilty. It is time to turn the tide, to begin to decriminalize migration. I think what we're seeing now is just the logical result of everything we've done since September 11th, 2001. As a nation, we're afraid. And historically, migrants have been a target of the nativism that arises when we're afraid. But I have hope, because I saw more than just hate and fear. Even amid the churnings of Operation Streamline, there were these moments of humanity. We had a judge, and the book on this judge was that he was a compassionate guy. I noticed that every time a migrant person would use an honorific with him, would call him sir, he would return that basic respect. He would either call them sir or ma'am. Those small things make a difference when you're grasping for human dignity. Several of the attorneys took extra care to advocate for their clients. A couple of them even getting them asylum hearings when that wasn't on the docket or in the plan before. And after we watched the proceedings, one of the attorneys who defends migrants in the Operation Streamline court volunteered to meet with us to answer questions. Like those of us in the courtroom on Monday, this attorney believes the system to be deeply flawed, and she told us she's been tempted to run as far away as she can. But she said she keeps defending clients because it gives her a seat at the table. I'd noticed her concern for clients when she advocated before the judge for one man from El Salvador. In his interview with Border Patrol, when he was asked whether he was afraid to return to El Salvador, he said no. He may not have understood the question well. But when speaking with his attorney, he said he was afraid of gang violence and provided strong reasoning to receive an asylum hearing. So she got the judge to put in his orders that he needed to receive an asylum hearing. And she said she'll be following up to see that that happens. So I want to end this morning by saying that yes, there are horrors happening at the border. But it doesn't do us any good to just be mad or sad or to flail around and scream and holler at the choir. We need to learn. We need to advocate. I think all the seeds of a revolution of compassion and kindness are present right in the middle of this terrible system. From the gritty determination of the No More Deaths volunteers to the attorney who refuses to have her clients dehumanized in the middle of a process that is about dehumanization. Human worth and dignity is still being advocated for, still being insisted on. I live with a few questions now. Could we organize a VUU trip to the border to work together and learn together and have it be beneficial to us, but more importantly, be beneficial to the volunteers who would lead us or to maybe the staff who would lead us? I'm having a conversation with Kathleen McTeague this week, who's the director of the UU College of Social Justice, to begin thoughts about plans for setting up a trip like that. I wonder, just preliminarily, I'm not going to write your names down, would you be interested in that kind of trip if we planned it? Yeah. So I'll be working on that question to figure out what that would look like. Another question I live with, what is our congregation's part in decriminalizing migration? I don't know right now, and I think we have a lot of learning to do, but what can we do as a congregation? Do you have ideas about that? If you do, email me, call me, mail me a letter if you still do that. Set up an appointment and we'll have coffee together. But let's think together about how our congregation could help decriminalize migration. How do we hold on to a vision of what could be in the middle of this time? How do we keep an eye on the North Star of justice and love and hope, and occasionally look at the news too? To remind us what's possible, I close with the poem The New Colossus by Emma Lazarus. Not like the brazen giant of Greek fame, with conquering limbs astride from land to land, here at our sea-washed sunset gates shall stand a mighty woman with a torch, whose flame is the imprisoned lightning, and her name, Mother of Exiles. From her beacon hand glows worldwide welcome. Her mild eyes command the air-bridged harbor that twin cities frame. Keep ancient lands your storied pomp, cries she, with silent lips. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. The wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed, to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. May it someday be so, and if it is, it will be because of our efforts and the efforts of all people in this country who are people of love and justice. May we be those people. Amen.